Hello, everyone. Now, welcome to episode 3 of the viaGood podcast, a podcast designed to inspire you, our listeners from across the globe, to change our world via doing good. Now, every episode, our guests will share ways that we can take action against the world's greatest challenges and achieve the UN Sustainable Development Goals. And you can learn more about the UN Sustainable Development Goals in the show notes of this show. Links will be left down below. And we'll also be discussing them a bit more later on in the episode. Now, this week's guest is the incredible Kate Chambers, who's a trustee at 2050 Climate Group. And Kate is an active volunteer at 2050 Climate Group, a youth-led climate charity empowering young people aged 18 to 35, working and living in Scotland to take climate action in ways that are meaningful to them. Since 2017, Kate has supported 2050 with branding, communications, and growing the charity's network. And I've had direct experience with her working on this. She was an integral part of the operational team, helping to deliver the group's flagship Young Leaders Development Programme before later becoming a trustee for the charity in 2020. In her day job, Kate is an ESG analyst at the CNC Group and has been a content creator for the BBC's The Social, where she created content on recycling, on fast fashion, on zero waste and active travel. And again, I will leave the links to that in the show notes. It's definitely worth checking out. Now, lastly, she is a wonderful friend of mine, and I'm delighted to share her story with you, our listeners. So over to Kate. How are you today?
I'm very well. Thanks, Cara. Thanks for inviting me onto the podcast today. It's great to be here.
My pleasure entirely. So yeah, tell us about yourself. Where are you from? When did your sort of journey with sustainability start? Just introduce yourself.
So my name's Kate Chambers. I come from a little town just outside Glasgow in the west of Scotland. And it's quite a tricky one to think back to how my sustainability journey actually started. But I think I was kind of reflecting on it. I think it was probably as I was finishing at high school, and it was quite a turbulent time. So it was the 2008 financial crash happened. Just as I was finishing up high school, we were going into a recession. And that's kind of when I started to think about bigger sort of political, social pressures and how they affected my life. And then that's kind of where, when I started looking into that, that's then how I understood how it's connected to our ecosystems and how we rely on natural resources to kind of build our whole economy. So that was a bit of an eye-opener for me, and I started getting into a lot of the sort of politics associated with that, the activist groups, and starting to kind of challenge my way of thinking, which had always been kind of linear economy is a great way to improve our lifestyles. And then suddenly I thought, oh, hang on, I've got all this new information that's shown me that actually we're really damaging our planet. And then from there, I just kind of became obsessed with how do we turn things around and create a lifestyle that's actually good for everyone that lives on the planet and not just some people.
Wow, I didn't know that. That's incredibly early to be thinking about these things. And yeah, I think the financial crisis, I mean, we're fairly similar ages, and I remember it being quite a shocking time and an eye-opening time. And everyone, for the first time in my life, also were talking about the economy and basically what we're going to do now we're in this crazy time and in that recession. So that's an incredible.
And do you not think it was a funny time as well, because it kind of threw everything we'd been told up in the air? You know, you'd been told to work really hard, get a good job, and then suddenly everything was coming crashing down. So it almost opened up the door to say, hang on, there's these alternative ways of living. So I think it was really, looking back, it was terrible at the time, but it was exciting to actually challenge some of these ideas. And as you said, probably that wouldn't have happened at that age otherwise. So definitely. Yeah, it's quite interesting to reflect on it.
Definitely. I'd never thought about it that way, especially it shows for the first time that you're not necessarily in control of the way that you live or the systems that are that have built the way that we're used to or accustomed to living. So that's really interesting. And in terms of, I guess, sustainability and educating yourself about it at that time, what did you really do to sort of learn more about the topic? Because it's huge, and I think this podcast is one way that I think people can get access to information about sustainability and what you can do to make a change. But at that time, there probably weren't so many podcasts. So what were you doing to inform yourself?
Well, it was funny because then I went to university, and obviously that totally opened me up to lots of other experiences and different types of people. And I joined a sustainability group at the University of Glasgow, and I actually got a job through that. So it was on campus, kind of promoting sustainable lifestyles on campus, and that was an incredible opportunity while I was studying. And to be honest, it was more I needed to get a job, and then this came up, and it sort of fitted really nicely with what I was doing outside of university and work. But then as well as that, I was also, as I said, like getting into these new political movements and almost trying to like understand different ways of thinking. And I realized that almost every sort of political or social campaign that I was getting involved with had an environmental or sustainability element to it that maybe wasn't at the forefront, but was kind of challenging me in a lot of ways. So, for example, at that time, I got involved with an organisation that was promoting fair trade. And on the surface, you're thinking, oh, this is like a better deal for farmers around the world to get a better price for their product. But then you start to think, oh, hang on a minute. No, like there's so much more going on here that is not just exploitative of workers, but also of the natural world. And then it gets you thinking about our consumption habits in the West. And then, so suddenly you're just going on this wild journey of actually learning so much more. But yeah, so I think that was kind of going on at so many different pockets of my life, if you know what I mean. Like I was getting involved in one thing that was then opening the door to another problem, another kind of big, complex global problem. And then you realize that it was all tied together. I mean, we'll touch on it today, but the SDGs kind of brings that all together in one place. Like these are large, complex, interconnected problems. And you can't ever just focus on one of them because they all link together.
That's really fascinating. And also, I think we should actually tackle what we understand sustainability to mean, because I think you touched on it a bit, particularly with the SDGs or the Sustainable Development Goals. And they're a framework that I think is really important because sustainability is so multifaceted. There are so many different directions to come at it from, be it, making sure that we're treating our natural world properly and we're sort of sustainably utilizing the resources, but even that phrase in itself is problematic. But then also there's sustainability in terms of, the way that people are treated and the way that people in supply chains and people that are working with the products that we consume are treated, and whether or not their livelihoods are taken care of, and so on. So I think we should probably unpick what sustainability means to you. And I say to you because I do think that everybody probably has a slightly different interpretation of what it actually means in practice, rather than the sort of the dictionary definition. So what do you think is sustainable? What do you think sustainability is?
Yeah, you've put me on the spot there with like a personal definition, because this is very much, I suppose, how I define it for myself, because as you said, it is so large. But I think sustainability for me means getting to a place where we live within our planetary boundaries, but in a fair and just way that is just for people and planet. So I think sometimes we can look at sustainability and it becomes synonymous with emissions reduction, for example, which is something that I work in at the moment. But that is only one piece. Like I saw this amazing visual that talked about, I think it was carbon tunnel vision, where it shows this this image of a man like looking straight ahead and all he can see is carbon emissions, but then in his periphery is all the other social and ecological problems that are also linked into our rising carbon emissions. But I think that I always come back to that as sustainability is so much bigger than emissions reduction. It's so much bigger than biodiversity loss. There, again, it's just that interconnectedness, but we want to get to a place where we're living safely within our planetary boundaries, but in a way that works for people and planet and not just for a certain group within society.
I love that. And I love the whole metaphor of, like carbon tunnel vision. And I think
that's totally not mine, but I need to find, I'll send it to you and you can put it in the link.
Definitely. I'd love to see that. And I will definitely share it because I think it's something that is quite tempting to do, just looking at one thing. I think because sustainability is so huge, and we will touch on this later, I think you almost want to gravitate towards what is the most effective way that you could see that you're doing well, or like what can you measure yourself against. And I think there isn't really a clear answer. If this is a certain number, then you're doing well, or this looks like this, then you're sustainable. We could talk about this forever, but I will move on. And it's actually a kind of related question, I guess, because I wanted to know more about your day job and also your role at 2050 Climate Group, and exactly what you do there and how it helps to tackle the climate crisis, which maybe is a very meta question, and maybe we can focus on one aspect of sustainability or one aspect of the climate emergency. But what do you do day to day to tackle that problem, or contribute to tackling it even?
I'll maybe start with 2050 Climate Group, which is how we met. So that's a good place to start.
A long time ago now.
A long time ago. So I got involved with the 2050 Climate Group. I think you said 2017. I always get muddled up with the dates. But the key thing for me through working with this amazing charity that's based in Scotland is looking at how to amplify young people's voices within this discussion about how we actually get to a place where we're living sustainably within our planetary boundaries. And I think, we've had discussions about this before, that it's so important to have different voices within this conversation. Otherwise, we're going to create a mold that doesn't work for everyone. And I think that was the key thing for me was, as a younger person, I'd kind of left university, didn't really know what I was doing with my life. I think we were probably going into our second recession at that point. Everything was falling apart. And I was just so frustrated with the lack of opportunity for younger people to actually get involved with policy making in Scotland, and also to just have a say on the future that we're supposed to be living in. It's promoting young people's voices and actually making that change. So that's the key thing that 2050 Climate Group does, is to empower young people to take action in ways that are meaningful to them, and then also give young people the skills and the confidence to do that, because that was a key thing for me. Was I'm sitting at home, I've got all these ideas, I'm really frustrated, I want to see action, but I don't feel like I'm the right person to do it. I feel so nervous to do any public speaking or put myself out there online or in person. So that's really the key thing that I find so inspiring about the 2050 Climate Group, is that it's about giving you the tools to do the action you want to do in a way that makes sense to you, not telling you, not being prescriptive about what climate action looks like to you. So that's kind of something that I've carried with me through everything I do, is that it's about giving people tools to take action. And then in my working life, I then started working with a number of different businesses. So I actually worked in circular economy consultancy for quite a few years, where I was working with lots of businesses to help them to look at how they could move from a linear business model to a circular business model. And that could be with new products. So we worked with a lot of really innovative circular products that were looking at how to reduce waste and keep resources in use for as long as possible. But it could also be looking at an existing business model and thinking about how a manufacturing company, for example, how they could take back their resource and look at repair, or how they could look at a leasing model rather than a sort of take, make and use model. They would lease a product to a customer and then have that ownership of the product to then look after that resource for longer and keep the value in the resource. So that's kind of what I was doing in my day job. And again, that just all tied into helping different individuals find their own sort of power or how they can amplify their own voice or their own ideas, and supporting with that. And then very recently I've moved into the food and beverage manufacturing sector, which is a big change for me, but it's really exciting. So I'm with a company that has real ambition to lower their carbon emissions and look at their full manufacturing supply chain to not just reduce emissions, but build a better connection with their suppliers to look at biodiversity loss, look at other challenges that are coming down the line, not just around emissions, but also around workers' rights and modern slavery and everything that's tied into a global supply chain. So it's a big challenge, and being part of one business is really exciting for me as well, because it's not something that I've typically done. Like, as I said, consultancy, you're kind of moving between projects. You leave before you see the real impact. So you might support them at the beginning, but then they go off and you don't know what happens next. So yeah, I'm really excited to actually be embedded in a company and support for the long term, and hopefully use those skills of kind of meeting people where they are, helping people to actually find their own using their own vision, but then having the confidence to take that where they want it to go. So yeah, I'm really excited to be in this new role, but very fresh into it.
I love that. And I love that you, even in your experience, I think because I know you, I get a sort of insider's scoop into the way you work and to the sort of different elements of sustainability that you work in. For example, with 2050, the program is obviously very holistic, and you touch upon the personal, the political, sort of working life, the professional, but it is more, I guess, focused to empowering individuals as part of a community, whereas your working life is definitely firmly in the sort of business space, I suppose. So yeah, I think this is a big question and there probably isn't an answer, but I think a lot of people struggle between taking responsibility in terms of individual action and being sustainable and tackling the climate crisis, be it making better purchasing decisions or not purchasing at all, actually just reusing at home. But that's a very, I guess, like individual focused solution. And then there are obviously industry level solutions as well. And what would you say in your own experience, or maybe generally, I'm not sure how you want to tackle the question, the balance lies, I guess, because I don't think responsibility lies with just one specific sector or one specific element, but it can be really difficult to place all the responsibility on yourself. You know, I'm not necessarily doing good enough because I didn't buy something from the zero waste store, for example. So yeah, how do you sort of deal with the different directions that people might be pulled in, or the different elements of their life that they might want to change in order to make change?
Yeah, it's the crucial question, isn't it? And I think one that we all grapple with in so many different areas of our life. But I don't know, coming back to it, because we're saying we're kind of similar ages, and I don't know if you found this as well, but I think our age group has kind of grown up into, I suppose, like, we were the early adopters of the internet, and then we came through to where we are now through all these different iterations of what activism means in a internet space.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that has really kind of impacted how we see ourselves as activists or as change makers, to make it more individualistic. So that's one thing that I try and really take stock of or like challenge myself about is that you're bombarded with this information that makes you feel like a bad person because you haven't done something to change. And then you're seeing all these kind of very surface level engagements that you could do where I'll buy a different kind of product or sign a petition, and you think, okay, I'll do that today, and then that's tick, like I've done a good thing today. So then you can like compartmentalize your activism into like, oh, but I did that today, and then now I can go off and do something else. And I think trying to challenge that, because it's such a lonely way to make change. And something that doesn't really interest me is sitting at home, kind of like I love sitting at home and reading and being online, to be honest, but it doesn't interest me in terms of change. And I think that community element is so important. And that can actually be like, it can be an online community and an in-person community, but you have to build the community for change where you're sharing ideas. And then on top of that, it can never ever just be consumer change. So it has to be bigger than that. And you touched upon how 2050 Climate Group looks at those different spheres of influence. And I really carry that with me all the time. You know, like a personal sphere of influence is kind of what we've talked about, where you have consumer power maybe, or you have advocacy in your own community. You have friends who listen to you and are interested in you. So you maybe have a bit of advocacy power there. And then you have your professional or your kind of study life or your community life, and then you have your political life. And I kind of split those three up and say, oh, well, if I take an action here, or if I care about a cause, how have I taken an action in each three of those spaces? And I think that's the key, is like, you can't just do the personal activism. It has to spill over into your professional life, then it has to spill over into your political life. And you kind of have to make sure that anything you're doing fits in to every aspect, not just one. And then in that way, you actually build friends and community. And it makes you feel more powerful because you can see that other people are just as impassioned as you about that cause. But if you're sitting at home buying a different kind of toaster, you're never going to feel like you have the power to change a system.
I completely agree. And it's really fascinating because just for you guys at home and for the viewers, I also used to work with 2050 Climate Group, and I also compartmentalized my my passions, not just about the climate crisis or about sustainability, but in general. If I want to make a change, I try to put it into those three spheres: the personal, the political, the professional. And I think that it's a shame that 2050 is only in Scotland at the moment, or possibly elsewhere. But
maybe soon.
Yes, for at the moment, it's primarily focused in Scotland. But I think that real approach is super useful, and I would definitely suggest you go to the 2050 website and check it out, even if you're not based in Scotland or in the UK, because yes, it's a really useful framework and a really fantastic program. And that's a nice segue into my next question about activism as a whole. And you touched on it earlier about particularly people in the sort of millennial / Gen Z generations. We're very used to working online. And I think most people see activism as synonymous with posting certain things on Twitter or whatever. Obviously, it's broader than that, but I think that's maybe the first picture that comes into your mind when you think of an activist, at least in this demographic. But it's really difficult to define, and not everyone would even identify as being an activist. So what do you think being an activist is? What do you think it means? And would you describe yourself as being one?
Yeah, there's so many loaded terms out there, aren't there, that kind of bring in negative connotations as well as positive. And I think activist is one of those where I think a lot of people can be frightened of not just how it's perceived from the outside, but what it means internally if you even say that, because it's like this pressure to be something that you don't feel like you're quite there. You know, like we see now a lot of trends around the imperfect whatever, so the imperfect activist. And I think that's really good, because there is this preconceived idea that if you're an activist, you somehow have it all worked out and you know exactly how things are supposed to be. And that's just not the case. Like, I think activism really is just passion for change. And that can be in any walk of life. Like, it's anybody who is passionate about some kind of change, whether they want their local park to be cleaner and safer. You know, if you are passionate about making that change, I would say that's an activist, someone who goes out and makes that happen by using the tools that are available to them. But yeah, I think people can be a bit intimidated by the term because it's a loaded term that perhaps makes them think that unless they are some kind of perfect moral person, they can't get involved or they can't call themselves an activist. And I think that's really dangerous. You know, like, nobody is perfect. Everybody makes mistakes. Everybody learns and changes. And what you might have supported 5 years ago could change and morph, but you have to like go with that and go with the learning process and not feel this pressure to kind of be perfect before you start. So yeah, I would say just, if you have a passion for something, if you see some kind of injustice or something that it doesn't even need to be injustice, it can be, I don't think that works. I think there's a better way to do that would make everybody happier. And this is my idea, and push off from there and then build your community around that. That's, to me, like the simplicity of what activism is. It's just caring about something and having a passion to do something about it.
I completely agree. And I think that's the whole like active part of activism. It's just, as long as you're active and you're doing something that aligns with whatever you think is right or needs to change, then I think that is showing activism, that is being an activist. Yes, I could talk to you for hours on that, but I will move on to the SDGs. So we've spoken a bit about the SDGs, or the Sustainable Development Goals. And as I mentioned, I've left a link in the show notes about what exactly they are. But in a nutshell, they're a group of 17 different goals that we as a planet, as humanity, are trying to work towards. They have indicators that sort of assess how far we are. And the 17 goals sort of focus on the pillars of climate change, but there are also goals on education, on poverty, on ending the water crisis, on peace and peaceful institutions. So they really are like a comprehensive framework for making our world better. And I think the fact that there are 17 of them shows how huge the problem is, but also the fact that they are, sectioned into different areas helps them be a bit more digestible, I suppose. But for you personally, Kate, which SDGs sort of resonate with you the most? And also, you've kind of already said it, that you find it an interesting framework, but do you work with the SDGs in your everyday life, be it professionally or otherwise? Or work towards them, not necessarily work with them.
I think the framework is really interesting and helpful. I don't know, at the moment, there's kind of talk about lots of organisations aligning to the SDGs, and I think that is really important, but it's kind of formally doing that, and then informally, I think at the moment I sit more informally, but they touch on everything that I've done basically in my work life, and I wouldn't say any are more important than another. I think what you said there about the linkage and how they all fit together is kind of crucial, but the areas that I've worked in, obviously with the circular economy, has been, I think it's number 12, resource consumption. That's been crucial to the work that I do, obviously climate action, but then the key one that kind of I see as like a keystone within it is inequality, kind of drives all of the other ones, and I think tackling that is the root problem to then support with a lot of the other goals. And that's kind of come back again and again, that as I learned more about how we are damaging our ecosystems, it always, for me, because I was so interested in waste and resources and the circular economy, I could just see this like exploitative monster, like runaway train that is just going in one direction of taking all of our natural resources and using them for a very, what seems silly, like a silly reason to waste these resources for such a illogical reason, just to create more and more inequality, is what the way that I could see it in a really simplistic way. So yeah, I think like the more that I learned about it, the more that I saw inequality is linked to all of these problems, and that we're only going to, you know, for example, like to create a circular economy, we can't just have the same unequal economy that we have now, but it's a circular one that damages people's health, where workers' rights aren't respected, but at least it's circular. And there's loads of really interesting research about this, looking at the kind of risk to workers if we actually start remanufacturing a lot of these materials in different parts of the world, where potentially health and safety isn't being recognised or workers' rights aren't being recognised. So there's this kind of lovely theory about, but things won't go to landfill, at least they'll be reused. But then you're not looking at how are they going to be reused? Who's going to build these materials? Who's going to take apart complex electrical equipment? Do they have the right health and safety to do that? And then the same thing with climate action. I mean, we need to reduce emissions, but is reducing emissions going to be safe and sort of, yeah, good for everybody? And how are we going to make sure that we're reducing emissions in an equitable way? So yeah, coming back to all of that, like it always just comes back to, but how are we going to do it? And is it equal and fair and just? And if not, then we need to take a step back and not just go straight to creating a circular economy or reducing emissions, but actually creating a safe and just world, and then move into the next steps, if that makes sense. That was a bit garbled, but not that's how it feels inside my brain.
Definitely. I think that's a perfect compass, actually, inequality and fairness and equity and all of the things that you touched on. And I think that's why I really value the Sustainable Development Goals, and why we at viaGood really try to align with them as a business, because I think you always need to, there is no magic bullet to any major problem. And I think having different categories and different aspects to think about always makes sure that the decision you're making is genuinely a good solution, rather than something that's the easiest or something that's beneficial for you or something that sort of is suitable for some people but not for others. So yes, and I can touch on so many things in terms of carbon emissions and net zero and so on, but I think that probably is a topic for another podcast in itself. So I wanted to ask you about a really big topic at the moment in the sort of climate sustainability space, and that is climate anxiety. Now, I think it's fairly obvious as to why it's such a big thing that people are struggling with at the moment, particularly with heat waves and with constant reminders of the potential and current destruction of our planet as a result of the climate emergency or the climate crisis. And obviously the IPCC report, IPCC, I always get the acronyms wrong.
IPCC, yeah.
IPCC.
You got it right first time.
Reports that are coming out again, which are basically saying that we should have acted yesterday. It's to be expected that people are feeling anxious and people are feeling nervous. But I think often what happens is when you're in a state of anxiety, actually thinking of solutions becomes more difficult because you're so overwhelmed and so stressed that often that in itself can lead to inaction because you don't know which road to go down. So I wondered if you had any advice on climate anxiety, probably because you work in this space, so you know more than most people how much of a problem we're currently in. So do you have any tips for dealing with climate anxiety?
I think it kind of comes back to a couple of things we've already spoken about. So we talked about this rise of the online activist, and then also a little bit about the perfect activist. And I think those two things really slot into a lot of the issues around eco and climate anxiety for me personally. So, you know, you're online a lot, you're taking in way too much information that no human is capable of dealing with. It's incredibly dangerous and overwhelming, I think, for people to know this much in this much detail without having the necessary channels to like put that grief and anger. So that's the first thing, that I think we just have more information than we've ever had before, which I think scientists have actually published research that is really damaging for human beings to try and deal with. And then on top of that, we've got this kind of perfectionism complex about how we alone are going to save everything, and we need to do everything that we can possibly do and be the best version of ourselves. And I think that comes from decades of this kind of like boss, whatever it is, mentality, this kind of capitalist agenda of like, do, be better, have more stuff, and keep grinding all the time. So those two things combined, I think, are just the perfect recipe for creating overwhelming anxiety when it comes to looking at not just climate, but a lot of the complex problems that we're facing globally. And this is like really personal for me because I've not really spoken about it very much, but this really affected me. And I suppose it was like burnout. It was just a real kind of mental health episode for me personally, where I just couldn't do anymore and I had to take a big break. And it was really scary to actually sit with that and be like, oh, I think this is because of grief for what we're losing, and working in this every day, it's so demoralizing in a lot of ways because we're not taking action in the very limited time that we have. We're not doing enough. And to actually sit with that every day, and you know, you're not going to a job where you can get a little bit of a distraction. This is your job, so you're reminded of it every single day. Then you spend your evenings scrolling on Twitter, reading more horrendous information. So I think the key thing that I've kind of learned to do is just to kind of teach myself how to step back from that level of responsibility. And it's quite egotistical to think that I could personally sort it out. You know, it's kind of, you have to take a step back and say, hang on, Kate, this is not you alone to do this. And what we talked about the community, that's helped so much for me as well, is that once you build this community of like-minded people, I mean, we're all going through it. We're all living through climate breakdown together. So in a way, that's reassuring to actually be around people who get it, who are not being denialist about it. Like, they're at the same stage as you. They're feeling like, oh God, we have missed our targets. Oh God, we need to actually sit with the grief of not achieving our goals. And then pick yourself up and be able to move on, like, with that supportive community. And just to kind of give yourself that space to say, oh, today, it's not burying your head in the sand, but today I need to just do something good for myself, like positive. It's all the cliched things that absolutely work, like get outside, drink water, eat healthily, take a break from social media, you know, all the things that we know we should be doing. And it really works. Like, we're never going to be useful or our best version of ourselves if we just keep pummeling ourselves with more and more negativity. We have to kind of build ourselves back up, and that can be in loads of really lovely ways. So yeah, and I think the key thing that I always come back to as well is just having fun, like, and not being too serious, and realizing, like, yeah, we're in a system, it's a total mess, and we know that, like, we know what's going wrong. Lots of us have ideas to make it better, and we'll keep pushing those. But then also we need to just live our lives and have fun, and not always be beating ourselves up about being this perfect person.
I second that so much. And I think, yeah, I think particularly working in this space, I think it goes back to, as we were talking about, the personal, professional, political, as much as that is an incredibly helpful framework that I use all the time, it also means that if you're feeling overwhelmed or anxious about something that you're trying to change in these three spheres, then it really does kind of encompass every element of your life when you start feeling worried about it. But I think what you said really hits the nail on the head in terms of trying your best, but knowing that sometimes good enough is good enough. And we can't change the world single-handedly, but with the right tools and the right community, and surrounding yourself with people who understand and who also feel similar feelings, I think it's really also empowering that people care so much that actually it's making them feel overwhelmed or making them feel anxious. I think that it's a horrible thing to experience, but also shows that you really care. And hopefully, if you're able to sort of unpick that with people who are good listeners and with a community of people who understand, like the viaGood community or like 2050, then I think that's a really powerful way to sort of feel better without being a denialist, which I think is the complete other end of the spectrum. And that leads me nicely to my last question, which is about system change. And I think even that question is quite anxiety inducing. But I also think it's an important one because for me personally, it helps if I feel like I'm not being particularly perfect one week, for example, in taking action individually, then I always try and think of the system and what I could do to make things easier, such as, you know, if you're unable to find certain products without plastic packaging, then what can you actually do about it other than yourself trying not to consume that? But you can write to local councils or to municipalities or to even the whole, you know, the EU or the US or, you know, whole bigger political systems, and try and get things banned or try and make change at that level, which is something I think people probably know less about how to do, how to contact decision makers. Within the viaGood app, we have a petitions section, which has been created in partnership with Care2. And there are obviously COP26s and COPs in general, COP27 this year, and lots of different I guess, ways that decision makers come together to make changes, whether or not it's through pressure from petitions or through these international conferences. But how practically can people get involved in those decision-making spaces? Because petitions are one way that are very democratic and that everyone has access to, but there are other avenues. So yeah, do you have any tips on making change at that level? Also to ease the pressure that we put on ourselves as individuals, because I do think some things are beyond us as a person who can make a change individually. So do you have any tips here on doing that?
Yeah, so I think the example you used there, Cara, of the petition is amazing. Like, and it does give you that little boost of endorphins just to say, no, I've done that today. Like, I think that's almost, if you think of it as like a video game, that's level 1. And everyone can knock level 1 out of the park and should, like, and it does give you that nice little boost. But then the other thing that I think is a great thing that 2050 Climate Group does, and I would really encourage, you know, you were saying about this podcast is global. 2050 Climate Group is based in Scotland, but there's a lot of the kind of frameworks we use that I think are so easily replicable across different parts of the world. So it was just last week that our policy subgroup, so part of 2050 Climate Group, everyone's volunteers, but they create their own little groups of where their interests are. And our policy group, they were responding to the Scottish Government's circular economy bill consultation. And obviously that is something that is of interest to me, but I could have sat at home and wrote a response to the consultation because it's personally of interest. But actually what the 2050 Climate Group policy team did was get people together in the pub for a drink and some pizza, and we sat together and we went through each question. We talked together. There was probably about 10 of us there, and we just discussed it, like answered the questions together as a collective group. And then they went round different areas, different cities in Scotland, and did a similar little focus group with different young people, and then collated the answers into the response to the government. And to me, that's like the perfect way to influence policy whilst also being part of a community, having that fun element where you're actually going out and meeting people and having a nice evening. And it doesn't have to be this sort of somber, I think sometimes people think, oh gosh, if I'm getting involved in policy, I need to be like really serious and I need to be wearing a suit. I don't know, you get these connotations in your mind as who it is that responds to consultations, but these are for us, the citizens. Like, we are the people who should be responding to these consultations. It's our opportunity to tell the government what we think. And then, as you said, like, it can be intimidating to go and speak to your MP or to write a letter to your MP, but getting together in these little groups, and you can form these so easily, like you can use social media to do it, or you can go out into your own local community and find out what community groups are already active. And then just getting people together who all care about the same thing and say, okay, well, we arrange together to go and see our MP. And you can practice, like we've done this before in 2050 Climate Group. It sounds a bit silly when you say it out loud, but we've actually role played speaking to our MP. What do I want to say? Like, am I going to feel nervous on the day? Am I going to get muddled up? Like, am I going to forget what I'm even there to talk about? And you can practice it. And all these things, like, they're so useful and they're so important to like the democratic process as well. And I think, to me, that's kind of these different levels of system change. As I said, like, you've got level 1, then you've got next level, interacting with others, responding to consultations, going to see your MP. And then also, we talked about the different spheres. That another area of the political sphere is actually getting out on the streets, going to demonstrations, using every tool at your disposal to make your voice heard on a topic is so, so important. And I also think another thing that comes up again and again when you work with younger people is they say, oh, but I'm not really ready to do that. Like, I don't really know. Or if you're in the workplace, you've got senior leadership teams who you say, oh, but I'm just a junior or I'm just a graduate. I don't really know that yet. No, like, your voice is so important, and trying to find people within your organization who actually respect the opinions of different groups is so important. And that takes a little while of research to do that, but it's so good to do, because I think that's such a powerful part of system change, is building those little networks where you say, oh, I know a guy who is in the senior management team and he is interested to hear from young people. Let's try and get a meeting with him. Or, you know that your MP, oh, I know that she cares about this topic. Let's get a little group and we'll go and meet her. So that kind of thing, it's like organising how you're going to use your time. That's the key takeaway. I've gone around the houses to say it, but I think the best thing I would say to make some kind of system change is to organise your time and to think, where am I going to put my time and how do I leverage my time to the best of its ability. Like, where don't just run around doing anything, but think, okay, I'll go to that demonstration on that Saturday, but then the next Saturday I'll organise a group to write a petition together. That kind of thing. It can be different levels of influence.
I completely agree. And I think the community side of things is what we've sort of kept coming back to, because that gives you the strength. It also provides the fun, as you say, being part of 2050 myself, and being part of a lot of the activities that you've just described really did take away the doomism, because you're with people that you genuinely like and you want to hang out with anyway, outside of the climate sustainability space. So when you combine those two things, magic really does happen. And for people who aren't based in Scotland or in the UK, I think, as Kate said, creating your own communities, even online through social media now, is one sort of huge suggestion that we would recommend. But also checking out which groups already exist. If you're like, oh, I'm not quite bold enough to actually bring people together, maybe it's already happening in your space, because I think particularly now more than ever, it seems people are switched on and are, even if they don't have the solutions, are definitely aware of the problems much more than perhaps older generations have been in the past. So yeah, I think community is the key to all of these different questions and all of these different aspects. So yes, I think we should leave it there because we've unpacked so much. Thank you so much, Kate, for joining us. This has been so enriching for me, and we chat about this anyway outside of the podcast, so I'm happy to have shared it with all of our listeners. And all that's left to say is go and check out 2050 Climate Group. I will leave all of the links, everything that we've mentioned will be linked below. If you haven't, download viaGood on the iOS store or the Apple store ahead of its 2023 launch. And thank you. Any final words, Kate?
I just want to say thank you so much for inviting me along to the podcast today. And it's really exciting to follow this podcast as well. You've had some great guests, so I look forward to seeing what's next.
Thank you. Very, very happy. You're welcome back anytime, and have a good rest of your day.